Welcome, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I was a little bit upset that I didn't end up including all the things that I'm about to discuss in the video itself, but I felt like it wasn't really right to include it. There's a few reasons for that. It's mainly just the fact that there's so much about everything regarding the Euromaidan protests and what led up to it, and what has happened since, that we really don't know too much about, in the sense that there's a lot of events where you had, for example, the snipers at Euromaidan, where we really don't exactly know who was behind it. There's the burning, like what happened in Odessa, where many pro-Russian protesters were burned alive in a building. We don't know all the details, and I feel like you can't really talk about this conflict without talking about those events, but it's really hard to talk about that if you don't really know exactly, or you don't know the whole story. So there's a lot of speculation, and I felt like that could age really poorly if I put it into my main video. And for that reason, I just want to make this video here, talk about everything, what we know, what we don't know, and well, maybe update it in the future, and maybe in a couple of years, once we actually have the full story, I can make maybe a follow-up to this video and talk about that. So anyways, we ended up around 2010, Yanukovych is president once again, and what he ends up doing is imprisoning Yulia Tymoshenko, who ran against him in the election. She was one of the leaders of the Orange Revolution, and yeah, he accused her of being corrupt in office, and ended up throwing her in jail. And it's kind of funny that he accused her of being corrupt, because Yanukovych was famously corrupt himself. He transferred billions and billions of dollars to offshore accounts, and he made himself and those closest to him incredibly rich. His own son he had included in many government adjacent businesses. He made a lot of money as well. And as we will see, after he ended up leaving Ukraine, people got into his mansion, and what they found was insane. I'm gonna show it to you later. But the thing is that, as we have seen, regardless of who was in power, whether it was one of the more pro-Russia guys like Yanukovych, or if it was someone who's a bit more pro-West like Yushchenko, the government in Ukraine was simply very corrupt. Right? It was something that apparently people, it didn't really matter who you were voting for. At the end of the day, your government was gonna screw you over. And the economic situation of the normal Ukrainian was very bad. And in the meantime, the government is robbing you blind. So there was a lot of anger already, not only directed at Yanukovych, who is of course very corrupt himself, but overall to the institutions, to the forces that be. And in 2013, Yanukovych refused to sign a treaty that had been long in the making with the EU, that would have brought the countries, or rather Ukraine, closer to the European Union. They would have had better economic ties with the West, which is something that a lot of pro-Western Ukrainians were really into, right? We have that very important East-West divide in Ukraine, which I think is one of the main takeaways that you have got to understand. You can't really think of Ukraine as this just homogeneous country. You have a lot of ethnic Ukrainians and a lot of Ukrainians who have a Russian background. And for that reason, there are many different interests in that same country and different opinions. And we see that even today, the areas that ended up supporting, or not everyone, of course, again, it's not a monolith, but where there's more support for Russia are those areas where there are Russian native speakers. And they have a very different perspective than those who are more to the West, right? Who tend to be much closer to Europe, and they want closer ties with those, and they want to be further away from Russia. So anyways, Yanukovych doesn't sign this deal. Instead, he goes for a deal with Russia, where they end up leasing Sevastopol again. They make a bit of a deal with the gas imports from Russia. That is something that Russia always kind of had over Ukraine. They could use their gas exports to leverage power in one way or another in Ukraine. But people didn't like this at all, because what was supposed to happen was that there was going to be a deal with the West. Yanukovych kind of did like a last-minute flip, and people felt like their trust had been broken. And that is why it is also in the west of Ukraine where the protests are going to be the strongest. So people feel betrayed and they protest in mass. And we are talking hundreds of thousands of people, if not even more. And this is what is called the Euromaidan protests. Now, Yanukovych's government really cracked down on the protesters. I mean, they were incredibly violent. Live ammunition was used. Many people were killed. And don't get me wrong, protesters also shot back at police officers sometimes, and several police officers died as well. But things went really bad on February 20 when snipers started firing at the crowd of protesters. And this is what I was referring to earlier. To this day, we don't really know who they were, but they killed over 100 people, I think about a dozen police officers. And that's what is so interesting. They killed both protesters and police officers. Now, were they the same group, different groups? Where did they come from? It's really hard to know. Everyone blamed everyone, right? The pro-Westerners blamed the pro-government, they blamed Russia, Russia blamed the West, and it's, again, really hard to tell. Eventually, the government that would come after did end up arresting some people, but the evidence is kind of shaky. There's a lot of contradicting testimony, and to this day, it's really hard to know. For example, there was a leaked call between the European Union's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Catherine Ashton, and the Prime Minister of Estonia. And basically, they were talking about the fact that the bullets that killed protesters and police officers were fired by the same gun, meaning that whoever was firing at people was firing at both sides, which sounds like an instigator, right? Which could mean some kind of third party, maybe Russia, maybe the West, or maybe it's simply opposition inside of Ukraine trying to make the government look bad, or it's really, really hard to tell. I think this was the event that made me decide not to include this in the video, because I was like, how am I going to talk about this? Like, these are the events, but we don't really know. And I mean, I would have to go into like a massive just sidetrack trying to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like I'm, covering for any side. And it was too much of a pain in the ass. So I was like, all right, I'm just gonna make a companion video, and that is what it is. But regardless, this was a breaking point for Yanukovych's government. He ends up fleeing to Russia. Then his government is declared illegitimate because he abandoned his duties, and they end up electing a new one. And this is when protesters enter Yanukovych's mansion and end up finding the craziest things. They found out that he had, and mind you, this is while your random Ukrainian is going through a very hard economic situation. He had a private zoo, tennis courts, helicopter pads, even a replica galleon floating on an artificial lake, and a ton of golden ornaments. And this really became a symbol of the corruption that unfortunately has plagued Ukrainian politics, unfortunately to this day. Now, don't get me started on how corrupt Russia is, that is a given. I've been focusing more on the Ukrainian part. That doesn't mean that I think Russia is not insanely corrupt. It is, like, fuck Putin, all right? Don't even go there. I'm just focusing on the Ukrainian side of the events, which I think are a bit more relevant to the situation. The violence continued for quite a while, and in a way, it never really ended, right? Even to this day. Now, in Odessa, there were very large pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian protests, and they clashed, which already meant violence. People were killed, shot, sometimes killed just, in fighting, not necessarily with gunshots. And eventually, the pro-Ukrainians, who outnumbered the pro-Russians, ended up attacking the pro-Russian protest camp, destroying it, and making the pro-Russians seek refuge in a building nearby. They then started firing at each other from the building to those who were outside. They started to fight. And this is one of those things where, again, what happened, no one really knows. But eventually, the building caught on fire. And I think it was 40-something of the pro-Russian protesters were burned alive, and over 200 were injured. And the problem is that the government then screwed up the investigation. What happened? Did the building catch on fire because someone deliberately tried to cause a fire and kill those inside? Or was it just a consequence of the fact that people were kind of throwing Molotov cocktails at each other? But we don't know, because the government messed up the investigation. And that's also one of the things that makes this so complex. Much of this, and especially those in the pro-Russia side, ended up blaming this on the far-right groups. And they may be right, they may not be. Unfortunately, we don't know. But all these things Putin considered to be unacceptable. Now, let's be honest. I don't really think that Putin was super worried about, the integrity in the politics of Ukraine. That's not what it's about. However, he saw an opportunity, right? There was incredible violence on both sides of the protesters, right? Both the pro-Russians and pro-Ukrainians had done extreme violence on the other, killed them in horrific ways. And Putin quickly started to call the pro-Ukrainian protesters fascists, neo-Nazis, and followers of Bandera. And this is a part that is very interesting, and it is true. Many Ukrainians, especially in the West, were indeed followers of Bandera in the sense that they really admire him. He has I think half of Ukraine currently approves of Bandera. And that's also one of the reasons why Yushchenko ended up giving the title of Hero of Ukraine. Now, from what I can gather, it's kind of a thing where they overlook. I mean, not everyone. Now, the far-right groups certainly agree with the ideologies of Bandera as well. But one of the reasons why Bandera is liked is like people just ignore, which I don't think you can separate that kind of thing from someone. But anyways, many people just ignore all the horrific things that the nationalists did and just say, well, Bandera fought for Ukraine, he wanted an independent Ukraine, and especially when there is conflict with Russia, Bandera is kind of a symbol of being anti-Russia. So that is kind of a reason why so many end up kind of admiring Bandera. Not everyone agrees with the ideology, and I think it's a very small part of Ukrainians who do agree with the ideology of Bandera. But it's mainly that he just became a symbol of Ukrainian independence and fight against Russia. So, and this is really something I want to stress. Be careful, right? Russia, especially in today's invasion, is trying really hard to paint Ukraine as a Nazi country, which is ridiculous, right? There are and have been Nazi parties in Ukraine. Ukraine does have a problem of far-right groups and far-right militias. It is a real problem that exists. But saying that it represents the country is insane, right? There are far-right groups, far-right militias in the US, in Germany, and we wouldn't really say that they represent the country as a whole. Now, there is the issue that Ukraine, for example, does have a party, which is the Svoboda Party, for example, which had a different name before. It was called the Social Nationalist Party. Try turning those two around and see what you get. And yeah, those guys are neo-Nazis, like straight up. But again, they are very small parties and they are not particularly popular. So trying to frame the entirety of Ukraine as neo-Nazis or fascists it just doesn't make any sense. Especially because you got Russia on the other side. And come on. You got the exact same problem on the side of Russia. This is not a situation where Russia is freeing Ukraine from Nazis. That's not a thing, right? There's Nazis on both sides of the conflict. Minorities for sure, but they do exist. Anyways, I got sidetracked a little bit. So it's 2014 and Russia now views the new government in Ukraine as illegitimate because the previous one had been forced out due to the protests. So he says, well, you're illegitimate. Guess what? I want Crimea back. So of course he was like, oh, well, there's so much violence against Russian citizens. I need to go in and defend them. Now, officially, that's not the way he said it initially. What happened is that soldiers just appeared in Crimea. The reality is that, well, you know how Russia had a port in Sevastopol, that's why I mentioned it in the video. They already had soldiers inside of Crimea. So those soldiers simply took over Crimea. And at the beginning, they didn't have any markings, so they were not officially from Russia. Russia denied those soldiers being theirs, so people called them little green men. Because if they didn't come from Russia, well, maybe they came from Mars. Right? Because obviously they came from Russia. Like, come on. Now, in March 2015, Putin did admit that he had been long planning to retake Crimea. And ever since, he has talked about it extensively as well. He has said that giving Crimea to Ukraine was a mistake and that he was simply basically fixing the wrongs of the past. And then Ukraine did something that, in my opinion, is completely unacceptable. They were like, well, Crimea originally didn't really have much water. The reason why they had so much water in recent years was thanks to the North Crimean Canal. And that water was coming from Ukraine. It was being diverted from Ukraine to Crimea. So they built a dam and stopped the majority of the flow of water into Crimea, which caused a severe lack of water. We are talking about like 85% of the water from Crimea came from Ukraine, and it got blocked off. That was a massive problem. And it also legitimized Russia. It was a great opportunity for Russian propaganda. Like, that's easy propaganda, because, you know, there's a real wrong being done there. Blocking water is completely unacceptable. If one country goes to war with the other and their neighbors and you share a river, building a dam is unacceptable. That is collective punishment of civilians. That is a war crime. You cannot do that. So that was an easy PR win for Russia. They used that. They did a referendum, which was likely bogus, but there's also many pro-Russian people in Crimea. So the extent to which Crimea would have wanted to remain in Ukraine, I guess, is up for debate. But especially after Ukraine cut off water and in all the years since, I'm sure that people have become much more pro-Russia. So a reunification of Crimea to Ukraine, I honestly don't see as a possibility. I'm going to be very honest with you. And by the way, once the Russians invaded, but at this point, it's like 2 years ago when this happened, not the invasion, I mean the event, they ended up blowing up the dam and thus restoring water flow to Crimea. Anyways, after this, heavily armed, masked rebels started to appear in East Ukraine, and they declared two separatist republics, LPR and DPR, the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Now, again, here there's much we don't know. Now, some of these forces were 100% just regular Ukrainians who were pro-Russia and who were legitimately, like a legitimate separatist force. Others were paid by oligarchs. We know that Yanukovych certainly had a hand in paying some people to, you know, participate in that. And Russia 100% sent at first, and it is also absolutely certain that Russia sent weapons and trained and eventually had Russian volunteers and later even regular soldiers participate in those regions. That is beyond question. So it is a complex thing. Right? Those regions are the most pro-Russian. And when you have such a polarization in the country, you have just battles to the death in any instance where there are massive casualties, where civilians killing each other by the dozens. It's very possible that you have just pro-Russian people who are just tired. They see that there is no answer coming from the Ukrainian government. And they see that pro-Russian people are being killed by pro-Ukrainian protesters. Now, the same thing happens the other way around, but we are looking at the POV of these pro-Russians. So many did look for Russia for protection. So there is always like a little bit of truth to everything. And again, that's what makes this such a complicated situation. And Russia absolutely also saw an opportunity on this. They're not just like, oh, you know, some pro-Russia protesters have been killed. No, they they just saw an excuse and were like, yeah, let's get involved here. They have been eyeing those resources, those territories for a long time, right? And it's also interesting, those regions, Luhansk and Donetsk, there was also they had their own republics for like a couple months after World War I, when we had that crazy period where there were like tons of republics. They had their republic as well, very briefly. So there is some history of separatism in those regions as well. Now again, Russia was not really just doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. There is an imperialist sentiment in them. They even call these territories Novorossiya, just like Catherine the Great had done when she ended up completely conquering them. And oftentimes they even denied the existence of the Ukrainian language. They simply say that it depends who you're talking to, either a dialect of Russian, which is completely incorrect. They are different languages, although they have similarities. They are strictly different languages. They are not just a dialect of the same language. But even more, some Russians have gone to the point of saying that Ukraine is misspoken Russian, which is again trying to cast a doubt on basically Ukraine's right to exist. Now, with the declaration of these republics, Ukraine sent forces, kind of counter-terrorism forces, to try to basically quell these rebellions, basically. And yeah, it escalated into a very long and bloody civil war. I guess you could call it civil war or a proxy war. The West quickly started to help and armed and trained Ukrainian forces, often including the far-right militaries like the Azov Battalion, which again are a very small part of the army, but still. And that's one of the issues. Ukraine, since they now were in this massive fight, where they were fighting not just these rebels, but they were clearly being armed, funded, trained by Russia, and often they were even Russian soldiers. When they were captured, Putin was like, well, they're not really our soldiers, they're on vacation, and, you know, people on vacation can go and do whatever they want. Now, you can say that's garbage excuse, and you are right, but you also gotta consider that the Russians are not the only ones who do that. There are tons of Americans and Europeans who go and fight in conflicts in other nations. Even in Ukraine right now, there were many Americans and people from Europe who went to fight in Ukraine, who were not Ukrainians. It is something that happens. So it's possible that they really were just Russians who were like, you know what, these are Russians, or they see those pro-Russian people in Ukraine as similar to them, so they want to go help. And it's also perfectly possible that Putin just sent those soldiers and then said, you know, you get captured, just lie. Of course, they're not going to be like, yeah, I'm here sent by Putin to do an illegal invasion. Like, no, they're going to lie, of course. Anyways, in July 2014, pro-Russian forces shot down the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, killing almost 300 people. So Ukraine really tried to retake these territories, but was just unable to do so. Many, many people died. Over 5,000 ended up dying just by 2015. Over 1 million people were displaced. So this is large numbers. This is a massive impact on the population. So in the end, what ended up happening was that they signed the Minsk Agreements 1 and 2, which were basically violated 5 minutes after they were signed. Minsk 1 was just a complete failure. Minsk 2, the idea was to grant these regions more autonomy. But Ukraine was like, well, we can't give you more autonomy unless you demilitarize. And they were like, well, we're not going to demilitarize until we get some autonomy. And nothing ever happened. And yeah, the fighting just kept going and going and going. And like I said before, Ukraine ended up allowing far-right militias into the army to help in the fighting. And that meant that the Azov Battalion got some official recognition, which is why they were even trained by American agents, right, from the CIA. And this was also, once again, fodder for Russian propaganda. They were like, hey, Ukrainians have literal neo-Nazis in their army, like neo-Nazi groups with neo-Nazi logos, right, in the official army. And they use that to smear the entire country as Nazis. They say Ukraine is run by Nazis. That is Russian propaganda, like literally. It's not true. Saying that, I've said it before, but claiming that Ukraine is run by Nazis is ridiculous. It is not. But there's also a reason why Russia insists on this. And this is why I talked about the World War II. Because there is a massive, massive fear or like a historical trauma in Russia because of how much they suffered at the hands of the Nazis. And keep in mind, in World War II, it was a relatively surprise invasion. Of course, everyone knew the Soviets were going to get invaded at some point, but it was still earlier than they thought, and it was still a betrayal invasion. And yeah, the Soviets and Russians later always had that fear, like, what if it happens again? Almost 20 million, not just Russians, but people died in the Soviet Union. 20 million! That's a number that leaves you scarred for life, for generations to come. So it is very effective. Everyone in Russia probably has great-grandfathers who either had someone very close to them die, maybe they themselves died. So it is something that strikes really close to home. So being like, oh, these guys are run by Nazis, has that effect of being like, be careful. These guys could attack at any moment. And then combined with NATO's expansion, it really allows for Putin to be like, hey, you see what they're doing? They're coming closer and closer. Especially when there's the option or the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. A missile from Ukraine to Moscow could easily take minutes. Putin said this in his speech at the invasion. It is a knife to the throat of Russia. Now, that doesn't justify the invasion, but it is certainly something that, one of my opinions is that the West, especially NATO, really didn't do much of a good job of de-escalating the situation, especially when you are dealing with someone like Putin, who is someone who is going to act tough the entire time. Now, Putin also claimed that Ukraine was committing a genocide of Russians in Ukraine, right, of the Russian portions of the country. That has been just widely discredited. Do not believe it. There's been many investigations, several ones done by the United Nations, and there is no evidence of any kind of genocide. War crimes, absolutely. Ukraine and the pro-Russian forces have both committed unspeakable atrocities on each other. But there's no evidence of any genocide being committed. That is simply, again, Russian propaganda. Ukraine then once again declared its interest to join NATO, but it never materialized. And this is one of those things where I really have to say, I have the feeling that NATO, or the possibility of joining NATO, was dangled in front of Ukraine like a carrot, right? I feel like Ukraine was manipulated by the West oftentimes, and that even to this day is being used as a bit of a pawn to try to weaken Russia. It is a horrifying thought because it is Ukrainians who are dying in this war, right? Again, caused by Russia. Do not misunderstand me. The responsibility of the war lies exclusively and solely with Russia and Putin. Right? There is no ambiguity there. Don't get me wrong. The invasion is completely unjustified, regardless of what Putin tries to say. I want that to be very clear. I don't want to see any weird comments calling me pro-Russian. But yeah, and I do worry about the future, not just because of the invasion, but because, well, the destabilization of the country is going to be very rough. Something that history has taught us is that extremist groups like the neo-Nazis that we see in the Azov Battalion can be legitimized when they are fighting a righteous cause. Right now, they are doing violence to defend Ukraine, which is objectively righteous. And that means that they can get support not because of their ideas, but simply because of the things that they are currently doing, which are objectively, for the good of Ukraine. But when things end, I hope that they don't gather enough support to drive the country into a direction that may be very bad and make things even worse. If you're interested in seeing me talk more about these kind of things, or you want to talk about it live, join me on my live streams at twitch.tv/TKNick. I'm going to be streaming a lot during February. I'm going to take it off. I've been spending way too much time doing animations. I'm going to take February off. I'm going to start reading. I got a bunch of books back there, which I'm not going to show you, about the next video, which is going to require a lot of reading. So I'm just going to read, work on the script during February, chill, and I'm going to start animating again in March and hopefully release the next video sometime late March, maybe during April. So it's gonna be a bit longer this time, but yeah, I do need to take a break. This video took about a month to make, which is a record. So yeah, I need to take a break. I need to rest, and I'll come back recharged for the next video. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you sometime in the future. I'm gonna be uploading some random videos in this channel, so you know, why not follow and see some other kind of content. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you some other time.